The first time Samuel Whitehawk heard that sound, a thin cry cutting through the howling wind, he thought it was just the storm playing tricks on his ears. But when he heard it again, weaker this time, barely threading through the blizzards, raw, he knew. Someone was out there, someone who wouldn't survive another hour in this white fury that had swallowed the Nebraska plains whole. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1867 was already being called the worst in memory. When Grace Henderson realized her husband wasn't coming back from Pine Valley, Thomas had left 3 days ago for supplies, promising to return before the storm everyone could smell coming. But the storm arrived early, savage and sudden, and now Grace stood at the frosted window of their isolated cabin, 8-year-old Emma pressed against her side, both of them watching the world disappear into white. They had flour for maybe 2 more days. The firewood was dwindling faster than she'd calculated, and the nearest neighbor, the Caldwells, lived 12 miles east. Might as well have been 1,200 in weather like this. Grace had grown up in Boston, where winter meant extra quilts and hot cider by the parlor fire. Out here on the frontier, winter meant something else entirely. It meant survival became a question rather than an assumption. Emma tugged at her mother's skirt. "When's Papa coming home?" she asked for the dozenth time that morning. Grace smoothed her daughter's dark curls, the same shade as Thomas's, and forced her voice steady. "Soon, sweetheart. He's probably waiting out the storm at Bergstrom's trading post. Smart men don't travel in weather like this." But even as she spoke, she felt the hollow space where certainty should have been. By the third morning, the cabin had grown so cold that frost formed on the inside walls. The fire struggled against drafts that found every crack, every imperfect seal in the logs Thomas had so carefully fitted last spring. Grace had already broken apart 2 chairs for fuel, telling Emma they were playing a game called Making Do. But games couldn't change the fact that they were running out of everything: wood, food, hope. That's when she made the decision that would either save them or end them. "Emma," she said, kneeling to button her daughter's coat with fingers stiff. From cold, "We're going on an adventure." The child's eyes, blue as summer sky, widened with trust that made Grace's heart ache. "To find Papa?" Emma asked. Grace nodded, though she knew they were heading for the Caldwells, not Pine Valley. 12 miles, in a blizzard, with a child. The mathematics of it were impossible, but staying meant certain death. They left at what Grace guessed was mid-morning, though the sky showed nothing but grey fury. She'd packed what little food remained, wrapped Emma in every piece of clothing they owned, and fashioned a rope between them so they wouldn't lose each other in the white blindness. The first mile wasn't terrible. The second brought wind that cut through their layers like knives. By the third, Emma was stumbling, and Grace could no longer feel her own feet. She tried to follow the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of their property, but snow had drifted so high that posts disappeared for long stretches. The world had been erased, reduced to the few feet of swirling white directly ahead. Grace's lungs burned with each frozen breath. Emma had stopped talking, a terrible silence that frightened Grace more than any complaint would have. They found shelter in what might have been a small grove of cottonwoods, though in the storm, the trees were just darker shadows in an endless white. Grace pulled Emma close, feeling how the child shivered despite all the layers. "Just rest a minute," she whispered, though she knew the danger in stopping. In weather like this, rest could become permanent. Time dissolved into the rhythm of wind and the gradually slowing beat of her own heart. Grace's thoughts drifted to Thomas, wondering if he was searching for them, if he was even alive. She thought of their small apartment in Boston, how she'd complained about the noise from the street below, What she wouldn't give now for that noise, that life that had seemed so constraining, but now felt like paradise lost. Emma's breathing had grown shallow, and Grace realized with crystal clarity that they were going to die here, in this grove that might not even be on any map. They'd become another frontier cautionary tale, whispered about in settlements and trading posts. The city woman who didn't understand what winter really meant out here. The mother who gambled her child's life on 12 impossible miles. That's when she heard it. Not the wind, not her own fading consciousness, but something else. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. Footsteps crunching through snow, steady and purposeful. Grace tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. She pulled Emma tighter, uncertain if this presence meant salvation or just a different kind of ending. The figure that emerged from the white was like something from Thomas's stories about the frontier. Tall, wrapped in furs, moving through the blizzard as if it were a summer breeze. But it was the eyes that caught her, dark and knowing, seeing them instantly despite the camouflage of snow and shadow. Samuel Whitehawk had been tracking a wounded elk when the storm turned vicious. He'd sought shelter in a small cave he knew, planning to wait out nature's fury. But the voices carried on the wind, not words exactly, but the particular pitch of human distress, had pulled him back into the white. He knelt beside them, his movements careful, understanding immediately what he was seeing. A settler woman and child, far from any cabin, already dangerously close to the sleep that doesn't end. Without speaking, he lifted the child, noting how she barely stirred. The mother tried to protest, or perhaps to explain, but her words were lost in the chattering of her teeth. Samuel had a choice to make. His village, Standing Elk, was closer than any settler dwelling, but bringing whites there, especially now, with tensions running high after the troubles at Fort Laramie, would not be welcomed by everyone. Yet leaving them meant death, and his grandfather had taught him that the Creator didn't draw lines between peoples when it came to mercy. He got them moving, supporting the woman with one arm while carrying the child. His knowledge of the land transcended the storm's attempts at confusion. Where Grace saw only white chaos, Samuel read the subtle language of wind patterns, the barely perceptible rise and fall of terrain beneath the snow, the way certain stands of trees bent that told him exactly where they were. The abandoned trapper's cabin appeared like a ghost ship in a white sea. Samuel had sheltered here before, knowing its history. Built by a French trapper named Dubois, who disappeared 2 winters ago, probably taken by the same kind of storm that now tried to claim these two. The door required forcing, snow having sealed it shut, but inside, mercifully, remained traces of civilization's attempt to carve safety from wilderness. Samuel worked with practiced efficiency, knowing they had little time before the cold claimed what remained of their strength. The cabin, though abandoned, still held remnants of its former occupants' preparations. A stack of firewood covered in canvas behind a false wall, tinder wrapped in oilcloth, even some dried meat hanging from the rafters, preserved by the winter air. He had the fire going within minutes, the flames seeming to push back not just the cold, but the very presence of death that had followed them inside. Grace watched through eyes heavy with exhaustion as this stranger, this Indian, her mind supplied with all the weight of stories she'd heard back east, tended to her daughter with a gentleness that defied every warning she'd been given about the frontier's native inhabitants. He warmed snow in a battered pot, adding something from a pouch at his waist that filled the cabin with the scent of herbs. When he helped Emma drink, speaking soft words in a language Grace didn't understand, the child's color began to return, the blue fading from her lips. "She will live," Samuel said, his English careful but clear. "The cold has not gone too deep." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He turned those dark eyes to Grace, assessing. "You are the wife of Thomas Henderson." The question startled her. How could he know? Seeing her confusion, he touched his chest. "I trade at Bergstrom's post. Your husband spoke of you, of the child, said you were new to this land." The mention of Thomas brought tears Grace hadn't known she could still produce. "He went for supplies 3 days ago, before the storm." She struggled to keep her voice steady. "Is he? Did you see?" But Samuel was already shaking. His head. "The storm came too fast. Many caught out, but Thomas Henderson knows to shelter, to wait. He is not foolish." As feeling returned to her extremities, pain came with it, the burning sensation of flesh coming back from the edge. Grace bit back a cry, not wanting to frighten Emma, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep near the fire. Samuel noticed, moving to examine her hands and feet with the same careful attention he'd shown her daughter. "No frostbite," he pronounced, "but close. You were lucky." Lucky. The word felt foreign in her mouth. Lucky to be lost in a blizzard. Lucky to be saved by someone her own people called enemy. Lucky to be alive when Thomas might be. She pushed the thought away. "Why?" she asked instead. "Why help us?" Samuel paused in his work, considering the question as if it held more weight than its single syllable suggested. "My grandfather told me once that the Creator sends storms not to punish, but to teach, to show us that survival depends not on the lines we draw between peoples, but on the mercy we show when those lines disappear." He gestured to the swirling white beyond the cabin's small window. "Out there, we are all equally small." Through that long afternoon, as the storm raged and the fire held it at bay, Samuel told her things that challenged every assumption she'd brought west. He spoke of his people's knowledge of this land, accumulated over generations, how to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes, which plants could sustain life when game grew scarce, the network of shelters and hidden springs that made travel possible even in the harshest conditions. Grace found herself listening not just with interest, but with a growing understanding that her survival, their survival, might depend on unlearning as much as learning. "Your people come to this land thinking it must be conquered," Samuel said, not with accusation but with something like sadness. "But the land does not wish to be conquered. It wishes to be understood." He showed her how he'd found them, pointing out signs she'd never have noticed. The way snow drifted differently, around living things, how wind patterns changed when moving around obstacles like human bodies. "Your tracks were already disappearing, but the land still held your story." Emma stirred, whimpering in her sleep, and both adults moved toward her. Their hands met briefly over the child's forehead, and Grace didn't pull away. In that moment, the barriers of culture and suspicion seemed as insubstantial as the snow that tried to erase the world outside. They were simply two people trying to keep a child alive. As darkness fell, the storm showed no signs of weakening. Samuel explained that traveling to his village was impossible until it broke. The path led through a narrow canyon that would be suicide to attempt in these conditions. They would shelter here, in this cabin that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of either world, Settler or Dakota. Grace found herself grateful for the delay, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Samuel prepared a simple meal from his supplies and the cabin's stores. Dried meat softened in hot water, some kind of root vegetable Grace didn't recognize. Tea made from pine needles that filled her with surprising warmth. Emma ate slowly but steadily, her natural curiosity returning with her strength. "Are you an Indian?" she asked with a child's directness that made Grace flinch. "I am Dakota," Samuel replied seriously, as if her question deserved a complete answer. "My people have lived on this land since before memory. What do you know of Indians, small one?" Emma considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. Mrs. Caldwell says Indians steal children and burn houses, but Papa says that's not true, that there's good and bad in all people. She looked at Samuel with those clear blue eyes. You don't seem like you want to steal me. A smile touched Samuel's weathered features. Your father speaks wisdom. I have children of my own, 2 sons, 1 daughter. They are probably worried about me in this storm, as I would worry for them. The mention of his family seemed to shift something in Grace's perception. Of course he had a family. Of course he worried and loved and feared like anyone else. How had she imagined otherwise? The night deepened, and the storm's voice became a constant roar that made conversation difficult. Samuel banked the fire carefully, explaining how to maintain it through the night without wasting wood. He showed Grace the signs that would tell her if the storm was beginning to break. Subtle changes in wind direction, the quality of silence between gusts. Then he wrapped himself in his heavy robe and settled near the door, a position that was both protective and respectful of the boundaries that still existed between them. But sleep wouldn't come for Grace. Her mind raced with questions, with fears, with a strange new awareness that everything she thought she knew about this land and its people might be wrong. Finally, she spoke into the flickering dimness. Your grandfather, the one who taught you about storms and mercy, is he still living? Samuel's voice came back quiet but clear. He walks with the ancestors now, but his words remain. There was a pause, then, he would have liked your husband. Thomas Henderson asks questions instead of making assumptions. That is rare among your people. The comment struck Grace with unexpected force. It was true. Thomas had always been curious, always willing to listen before judging. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him, this openness that seemed to embarrass his more conventional friends. Tell me about your village, she found herself asking, about your people. And through the long hours of that storm-bound night, Samuel did. He spoke of Standing Elk Village, nestled in a valley where hot springs kept the worst of winter at bay, of ceremonies that marked the seasons, of children learning to read the land's language before they learned to read books, of the changes coming, railways and settlers and treaties that shifted like sand, and his people struggled to adapt without losing themselves entirely. By the time dawn's grey light began to filter through the frost-covered window, Grace understood that she'd crossed more than physical distance in this journey. The world was larger and more complex than the simple stories she'd been told, and survival, true survival, might require more than strong walls and good rifles. It might require the wisdom to know when to set aside fear and accept the hand extended in kindness. Emma woke as the light strengthened, immediately moving to the window. Mama, look! The storm had finally begun to ease, though snow still fell steadily. Visibility had improved from mere feet to perhaps 100 yards. Samuel was already up, studying the sky with an expression Grace was learning to read. It weakens, he said. By midday, perhaps, we can move. But the decision brings difficulty. He explained the situation with careful honesty. The storm had likely erased all tracks, making it nearly impossible to determine what had become of Thomas. The path to Pine Valley was longer and more dangerous than the route to his village. But taking them to Standing Elk meant crossing boundaries both physical and cultural that might have consequences for all involved. Some among my people will not welcome you, he said plainly. There has been too much blood, too much taking, but neither can I leave you to find your way alone. The storm has made the land new, trails buried, landmarks changed. Without guidance, you would die. Grace felt the weight of the decision. Everything she'd been taught urged her toward Pine Valley, toward the familiar, even if it meant greater risk. But something had shifted in the night's long conversation. She found herself trusting this man who had every reason to leave them to their fate, but had chosen mercy instead. "If we go to your village," she asked carefully, "what then?" "You would be fed, sheltered until word can be sent to Pine Valley. Your husband would be found and brought to you, or you to him when travel is safe." He paused, choosing his words. "You would see that we are not what your stories make us, and perhaps some of my people would see the same of you." Emma, who had been listening with the intense focus children bring to adult conversations, tugged at Grace's skirt. "I want to see the Indian village," she announced. "Samuel has children. Maybe they'll play with me." The simple statement, unburdened by generations of fear and mistrust, seemed to clarify everything. Grace took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. "We'll go to Standing Elk," she said. Samuel nodded, and she thought she saw approval, perhaps even relief in his expression. They prepared to leave as the morning advanced, Samuel crafting snowshoes from materials in the cabin while Grace packed what supplies they could carry. He showed her how to wrap Emma in layers that would trap heat while allowing movement, how to recognize the signs of returning frostbite. Just before they departed, Samuel did something that surprised her. He took a piece of charred wood from the fire and made marks on the cabin wall, symbols Grace didn't understand, but that seemed to carry meaning. "If others come," he explained, "they will know someone sheltered here safely. They will know which direction we traveled." It was, she realized, a form of writing she'd never considered, a language that spoke to those who knew how to read it. They emerged into a world transformed. The blizzard had sculpted the landscape into something alien, familiar landmarks buried under drifts that reached heights Grace wouldn't have thought possible. But Samuel moved with confidence, reading signs in the wind-carved snow, the angle of bent trees, the lay of the land beneath its white blanket. He carried Emma on his back, the child secured with strips of blanket, while Grace followed in his footsteps, grateful for the path he broke through the deeper drifts. At first, the going was easier than Grace had feared. The wind had died to occasional gusts, and the snow fell now in large, lazy flakes rather than the stinging needles of the day before. Emma chattered excitedly, pointing out shapes in the snowdrifts, asking Samuel questions about every track and sign he showed them. Her resilience amazed Grace. Children, it seemed, adapted faster than adults to new realities. They stopped frequently, Samuel insisting on rest before exhaustion set in. During one such pause, sheltered in the lee of a rock formation, he produced a small pouch and offered Grace something that looked like dried berries mixed with fat. "Wasna," he said, "what you call pemmican, gives strength for long journeys." The mixture was surprisingly good, rich and sustaining in a way that spoke of generations perfecting the recipe for exactly this purpose: survival in a harsh land. As they traveled, Samuel began teaching without seeming to teach, pointing out things Grace would never have noticed. A slight depression in the snow that marked where a creek ran beneath. The way certain birds' calls meant predators were near. How the color of the sky in different directions could predict weather changes hours in advance. Grace found herself absorbing it all with an intensity born of understanding that this knowledge might mean the difference between life and death in her new home. They were perhaps halfway to their destination when they crested a rise, and Samuel stopped abruptly, his posture changing in a way that made Grace's heart race. Below them, barely visible through the still falling snow, moved shapes that resolved into men on horseback. "Dakota," Samuel said quietly. "Hunting party from my village. But these are young men, hot-blooded. This meeting must be handled carefully." He set Emma down, instructing both to stay behind him. Then he called out, a long, musical phrase that echoed across the snowy expanse. The riders wheeled their horses, and Grace counted 5 of them, wrapped in furs and blankets, their faces hard to distinguish at this distance. They approached at a canter that sent snow flying, and Grace instinctively pulled Emma close. The conversation that followed was in Dakota, rapid and intense. Grace couldn't understand the words, but she could read the tones. Surprise, suspicion, argument. The youngest of the riders, his face marked with paint that stood out starkly against the white world, gestured sharply toward Grace and Emma. Samuel's responses were calm but firm, and gradually the tension seemed to ease, though not disappear entirely. Finally, Samuel turned back to Grace, his expression careful. "They are surprised to see you here. Some argue we should take you to Pine Valley instead, but I have explained the storm, explained what I found." He glanced at Emma, who was watching the mounted warriors with more curiosity than fear. "I told them about the child, how she would not have survived another hour. This carries weight." The rider who had argued most fiercely nudged his horse closer. He was young, perhaps 20 winters, with eyes that held both the fire of youth and the wariness of someone who had seen too much change too quickly. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Why should we trust you in our village? Your people take everything, land, buffalo, the very rivers. Now we should welcome you to our homes." Before Grace could respond, Emma stepped forward, her small voice carrying clearly in the snow-muffled air. "We didn't take anything. We're just cold and scared. My papa is lost in the storm." She looked up at the young warrior. "Do you have a papa?" The simplicity of the question seemed to catch him off guard. His fierce expression wavered, and for a moment Grace saw not a warrior but a son, a brother, perhaps someday a father. The tension shifted, though it didn't disappear entirely. After more discussion in Dakota, the hunting party agreed to escort them to the village, though Grace sensed this was more out of respect for Samuel than acceptance of her presence. They traveled now as a group, the hunters flanking them in a protective formation that Grace realized was as much about keeping them under watch as keeping them safe. One of the older hunters offered his horse to carry Emma, lifting her up with surprising gentleness when Samuel nodded approval. The child, exhausted from the morning's trek, soon dozed against the man's chest, trusting in the way only children can. As they rode, Grace found herself beside the young warrior who had challenged them. His name, she learned, was Red Sky. "A name earned," Samuel explained quietly, from his habit of watching the dawn for signs and portents. "Your husband," Red Sky said suddenly. "He is the one who traded fairly last moon, who argued with Bergstrom about the price of furs." Surprised, Grace nodded. "Thomas believes in fair dealing. He says trust is worth more than profit." Red Sky considered this, his face thoughtful. "My father trades with him, says he is different from most whites. But one good man does not change what is happening to our lands." The honesty of his words struck Grace. How could she argue? She had seen the changes even in her short time here, the buffalo herds diminishing, the increasing tension at the trading post, the way some settlers spoke of Indians as if they were obstacles to be removed rather than people with equal claim to life. The landscape began to change as they traveled, the flat plains giving way to a series of low hills that provided natural windbreaks. Steam rose from several points in the distance, and Grace realized they were approaching the hot springs Samuel had mentioned. The snow was thinner here, the ground warmer, creating a microclimate that felt like stepping from deep winter into late fall. Standing Elk Village appeared gradually, as if emerging from the land itself rather than imposed upon it. The teepees were arranged in a careful circle, their buffalo hide covers decorated with symbols that meant nothing to Grace but clearly told stories to those who could read them. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and despite the recent storm, life continued. Women working hides, children playing a game with sticks and a ball. Elders gathered around a central fire. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. People emerged from tipis and work areas, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Grace felt the weight of dozens of eyes, some curious, some hostile, most simply wary. Emma, now awake, pressed closer to her mother, suddenly shy in the face of so much attention. Samuel dismounted and helped them down, his presence a shield against the growing crowd. An older man approached, his bearing one of natural authority despite his lack of ceremonial dress. His face was weathered like old leather, but his eyes held a sharpness that seemed to see through pretense. This, Grace intuited, was a leader, not through force, but through wisdom earned over many winters. Samuel spoke to him at length in Dakota, gesturing occasionally toward Grace and Emma. The chief, for that's what he was, though Grace would later learn his role was more complex than that simple title suggested, studied them for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the rhythm of someone used to being heard. Samuel Whitehawk says the storm brought you to us, that the spirits guided his path to find you. He paused, seeming to weigh each word. We have laws about hospitality, ancient laws, but these are difficult times. The woman stepped forward from the crowd, older, her grey hair woven with beads, her dress decorated with intricate quill work. She spoke rapidly in Dakota, her tone sharp with disapproval. Others joined in, voices rising in what was clearly becoming a heated debate. Grace caught fragments of meaning from gestures and tones, fear, anger, references to past betrayals. Then Emma did something that surprised everyone, including Grace. She stepped away from her mother's protective embrace and walked directly to the chief. From her pocket, she pulled out a small object, a carved wooden horse that Thomas had made for her last Christmas. She held it up to the chief, her voice clear despite its smallness. This is my horse. His name is Storm. Papa made him for me. I want you to have him for letting us stay warm. The simplicity of the gesture cut through the debate like a blade. The chief knelt to Emma's level, accepting the toy with the gravity one might show for a peace treaty. He examined it carefully, running his fingers over the careful carving. Your father has skill, he said softly. The horse has spirit. He looked up at Grace. Children see with clearer eyes than we who carry too many memories. You will stay. The storm has decided. The woman who had protested stepped forward again, but this time her demeanor had shifted. She studied Emma with an intensity that made Grace nervous, then reached out to touch the child's dark curls. Whatever she saw seemed to settle something within her. She spoke again, and though Grace didn't understand the words, the tone had changed from opposition to resignation, perhaps even acceptance. This is Morning Song, Samuel explained. She lost her own daughter to the spotted sickness 2 winters ago. She sees something in your child that calls to her heart, though she fights against it. Morning Song said something else, gesturing toward a teepee set slightly apart from the others. She offers her sister's lodge for your shelter. Her sister walks with the ancestors now, but the lodge stands empty. It is warm and well made. Grace felt tears threaten. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of the overwhelming strangeness of finding kindness where she'd been taught to expect only danger. Thank you, she managed, the words feeling inadequate. Morning Song's response was a short nod, though her eyes remained on Emma with something like wonder mixed with old grief. The lodge they were given was indeed warm, the buffalo hides thick and well sealed against drafts. A fire pit in the center was already laid with kindling, and Samuel showed Grace how to maintain it properly, how the smoke hole worked, how to adjust the flaps for ventilation. The interior was spare but clean, with raised platforms covered in furs for sleeping, and various tools and containers hung from the lodge poles. As Grace and Emma settled in, women from the village began to arrive with gifts, food, blankets, a small pot for cooking. Not all came with warmth in their eyes, but they came nonetheless, honoring the chief's decision and the ancient laws of hospitality. One young woman, heavily pregnant, brought a doll made from corn husks and dressed in tiny deer-hide clothes. She pressed it into Emma's hands with a shy smile, speaking words Grace didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. "Her name is Soft Rain," Samuel translated. "She says her child will need a friend when it comes. Perhaps your daughter will still be here to welcome it." The possibility hung in the air that they might stay longer than just until the storm passed, that connections might form that transcended the simple need for shelter. As afternoon deepened toward evening, Grace found herself sitting by the fire with several women who had overcome their initial wariness. Through Samuel's translation and a surprising amount of gesture and demonstration, they began to teach her things: how to prepare the dried meat properly, how to bank the fire for long burning, the properties of different herbs hanging in bundles from the lodge poles. It was, she realized, not so different from the way women in Boston had gathered to share knowledge, though the content was vastly different. Emma had discovered other children, and after some initial shyness on both sides, was engaged in what seemed to be a universal game of chase around the central fire. Language barriers meant nothing to children at play, and soon Grace heard her daughter's laughter mixing with that of Dakota children as if they'd known each other always. The young warrior Red Sky appeared at the lodge entrance as darkness fell, his manner formal but less hostile than before. "The chief asks if you will eat with us tonight. There will be counsel about finding your husband." The invitation felt significant, a step towards something more than mere tolerance. Grace smoothed her dress, travel-stained and worn, but the best she had, and gathered Emma, whose face was flushed with cold and excitement. The communal fire burned bright against the winter darkness, surrounded by what seemed to be most of the village. Food was being prepared in large pots: a stew, rich with meat and roots, bread baked on hot stones, tea made from pine needles and other herbs. Grace was given a place of honor near the chief, with Samuel beside her to translate. Emma sat between them, wide-eyed at the ceremony of it all. Before eating began, the chief stood and spoke at length. Samuel leaned close, translating in a low voice. He tells the story of the storm, of finding you, of the choice to offer shelter. He reminds everyone of the old ways, that kindness to strangers brings blessing, that the spirits test us through the unexpected. He says that perhaps this meeting has purpose beyond what we see. The meal itself was rich and warming, the conversation a mix of languages and gestures. Grace found herself telling the story of their journey west, the hopes that had driven them, the challenges they'd faced, the way Thomas had insisted on learning about the land from anyone willing to teach. She spoke of Boston, of buildings that touched the sky and streets that never slept, drawing amazed responses from some of the younger Dakota who had never seen a city. But it was when she spoke of losing her parents to cholera, of being alone in a world that suddenly seemed vast and uncaring, that she saw recognition in many eyes. Loss, it seemed, was a universal language. Morning Song reached across the fire to touch Grace's hand briefly, a gesture that said more than words could have. As the meal wound down, the chief called for attention again. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we will send riders to Pine Valley and to other places where your husband might have sheltered. The storm has passed enough for travel, though the danger is still real. Until then, you are under our protection." He looked directly at Grace. "Perhaps when your husband comes, he will see that we are not the monsters your people's stories make us. Perhaps he will carry this truth back to others." The evening ended with songs, haunting melodies that spoke of seasons and spirits, of hunts and harvests, of love and loss. Grace didn't understand the words, but the emotions they carried needed no translation. Emma had fallen asleep against her shoulder, the corn-husk doll clutched tight, her small face peaceful in the firelight. Back in the lodge, as Grace prepared, Emma for bed, Morning Song appeared with two more women. They carried items Grace hadn't expected, a dress of soft deer hide, moccasins lined with rabbit fur, leggings and a warm shirt for Emma. "For tomorrow," Morning Song said through Samuel, "your clothes are thin for winter. These will keep you warm while you are with us." The gesture broke something in Grace, some last wall of reserve or fear. She found herself embracing Morning Song, tears flowing freely as the older woman held her with unexpected tenderness. When they parted, Morning Song touched Grace's face gently and spoke words that Samuel translated as, "Grief knows no color, neither does a mother's heart." That night, as the fire burned low and Emma slept surrounded by new blankets and old kindness, Grace lay awake thinking about everything she'd believed before coming west. The frontier had seemed like a clear line between civilization and wilderness, between safety and danger. But here in this Dakota village, she was discovering that the real frontiers were internal, the boundaries we build in our minds between us and them, between fear and understanding. Outside, she could hear the village settling into sleep, the soft nickering of horses, the occasional cry of a night bird, the murmur of voices carrying on the cold air. It was foreign, yet increasingly familiar, like a song heard in a dream that slowly becomes real upon waking. Tomorrow would bring the search for Thomas, would bring new challenges and perhaps difficult choices. But tonight, in this unexpected shelter, Grace allowed herself to hope that they had crossed not just miles of frozen prairie, but something far more significant. Samuel had said that storms came not to punish, but to teach. Lying there in the warm darkness of a Dakota lodge, listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing, Grace began to understand what he meant. Sometimes it took being lost to find what you didn't know you were looking for. Sometimes it took a stranger's kindness to show you the limitations of your own understanding. She thought of Thomas, hoping he was safe, wondering what he would make of all this. He had always been the one to question assumptions, to look beyond the obvious. Would he see what she was beginning to see? That the greatest danger on the frontier wasn't the harshness of the land or the difference between peoples, but the blindness that came from believing you already knew all the answers. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a small shower of sparks. Through the smoke hole, Grace could see stars, the same stars that shone over Pine Valley, over Boston, over every place she'd called home. Constants in a world of change. She closed her eyes, feeling for the first time since the storm began. That morning would come, and with it, possibility. Dawn came slowly to Standing Elk Village, the light seeping reluctantly through clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. Grace woke to the sound of movement outside. Muffled voices, the stomping of horses, the particular creak of leather and wood that meant preparations were underway. She slipped from beneath the warm furs, careful not to disturb Emma, who slept. Curled like a small hibernating animal, her face peaceful in the dim light filtering through the smoke hole. The deer-hide dress Morning Song had given her felt almost natural now as Grace pulled it on, fastening it with growing confidence. Just 2 days in the village, and already her fingers had begun to learn new patterns, her body adapting to different ways of dressing, moving, being. She paused, catching her reflection in the small trade mirror hanging from a lodge pole. The woman who looked back seemed both familiar and strange. Hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned tight, skin flushed with wood smoke and health. Rather than pale from city living, eyes that held knowledge she hadn't possessed a week ago. Outside, the search parties were gathering. 6 riders in all, 3 heading toward Pine Valley, 3 toward other settlements and known shelter spots along the winter routes. Red Sky would lead one group, his earlier hostility now tempered by grudging acceptance, perhaps even respect. The change had come yesterday when he'd found Emma teaching Dakota children how to make a cat's cradle with string, the kind Grace had taught her on long wagon journeys west. The young warrior had watched, expressionless, then sat down among the children, his hands awkward but gentle as Emma showed him how to transfer the pattern from her small fingers to his calloused ones. Samuel would go with the Pine Valley group, his knowledge of both worlds, making him invaluable as translator and mediator. He stood now beside his dappled mare, checking the cinch strap with methodical attention. Even from a distance, Grace could sense his concern, not just for the mission ahead, but for what awaited her family regardless of outcome. They had crossed invisible boundaries these past days, and such crossings never came without consequence. Grace approached the group, pulling, her borrowed fur wrapped tight against the morning chill. "I want to come," she said, her voice carrying in the crisp air. The men turned, expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. But it was the chief who answered, his voice gentle but firm as Samuel translated. "The snow is deep, the cold still dangerous. Your place is here with your daughter. Trust that we know this land, that we will find your husband if he can be found." The helplessness of waiting clawed at her, but Grace recognized the wisdom in his words. She'd already risked Emma once in her desperate attempt to reach safety. She wouldn't do so again, no matter how her heart ached to be part of the search for Thomas. Instead, she nodded, pressing her lips into a tight line to keep emotions at bay. "Tell them," she started, then faltered, finding the perfect words. Elusive. "Tell them to look for his red scarf. He always wears it in winter. My mother knitted it for him before we left Boston." Samuel translated, and several of the riders nodded. Red Sky touched the hilt of his knife, a gesture that Grace had learned signified a promise or oath. Then, with minimal ceremony, they mounted and rode out, hooves cutting fresh tracks in the new fallen snow. Grace watched until they disappeared into the white distance, figures gradually diminishing against the vast Nebraska landscape until they seemed no more substantial than spirits. When she turned back toward the village, Grace found Morning Song waiting, her weathered face impassive, but her eyes kind. "Come," the older woman said in halting English. "Waiting is women's hardest work. Better to keep hands busy while heart waits." Grace followed her toward a circle of women gathered by one of the larger lodges, feeling the weight of curious glances, but also a new sense of welcome that hadn't been present yesterday. The day unfurled in a rhythm entirely different from Grace's previous life. The women of Standing Elk Village, perhaps sensing her need for distraction, drew her into their daily tasks with gestures and simple words repeated until she understood. She learned to scrape a deer hide without tearing the precious material, her unpracticed hands quickly developing blisters that soft rain, the young pregnant woman from yesterday, treated with a salve that smelled of pine and something earthier. Grace watched Morning Song work intricate patterns into a pair of moccasins, the bone needle moving with practiced precision that spoke of decades of experience. "For the little one," Morning Song explained, holding up the tiny footwear, meant for Emma. "Winter not finished, she needs good shoes." The gift brought unexpected tears to Grace's eyes, not just for the generosity it represented, but for the acceptance implicit in preparing something meant to last beyond their immediate stay. Emma had found her place among the village children with remarkable ease. Unlike Grace, who still struggled with the cultural barriers of adulthood, Emma moved through her new environment with the adaptability that seemed unique to childhood. By mid-morning, Grace could hear her daughter's laughter ringing out as she played the stick game she'd been watching yesterday, already grasping rules that seemed to exist more in gesture than explanation. "She learns quickly," observed an elderly woman who had joined their work circle. her fingers still nimble despite their gnarled appearance. Children see with clearer eyes, no shadows yet. Samuel had told Grace that this woman, White Feather, was the oldest in the village, a keeper of stories and traditions that stretched back to when Standing Elk Village had stood far to the east, before the pressures of white settlement had pushed them westward. "She's always been curious," Grace replied, watching as Emma successfully caught the small woven ball on her stick, earning cheers from her playmates. "Her father says she has more questions than there are stars." The mention of Thomas brought a fresh pang of worry. Where was he now? Had he survived the storm? Was he searching for them as desperately as they were searching for him? White Feather seemed to read her thoughts. "The men will find him if he lives," she said matter-of-factly. "Samuel Whitehawk reads the land like others read books. Red sky, has eyes sharper than his namesake. If your husband shelters anywhere within 2 days' ride, they will bring him back." Her certainty offered both comfort and a new wave of anxiety. What if Thomas hadn't found shelter? What if he lay somewhere beneath the snow, beyond reach of even the most skilled trackers? It was during the quiet hour after the midday meal that Morning Song finally spoke of her daughter. They sat alone in the lodge, working on the endless task of preparing sinew for thread, when the older woman began to talk in halting English, interspersed with Dakota words that Grace was beginning to recognize. "My small bird was like your Emma, always laughing, always running. The spotted sickness came when the leaves were falling. Many children walked the spirit path that winter." Grace set aside her work, recognizing the gift being offered, this sharing of grief, this bridge between their separate sorrows. "I lost my mother to sickness too," she said softly. "In Boston, they called it cholera. It took thousands in just weeks." Morning Song nodded, understanding in her dark eyes. "Sickness knows no boundaries. Death visits all peoples, but life." She gestured toward the lodge opening, where Emma's voice could be heard among the others. "Life also finds a way." The conversation opened something between them, a space where differences in language and culture receded, where they were simply two women who had known loss and found ways to continue. Morning Song began to teach Grace more deliberately, showing her how Dakota women had survived countless winters, through skills passed down through generations. She demonstrated the precise way to twist sinew into thread strong enough to hold between seasons, how to identify which plants still offered medicine even beneath snow, how to read weather changes in the color of the sky and the behavior of birds. As the day wore toward evening with still no sign of the search parties, Grace found herself drawn to the edge of the village, staring out at the white expanse that had swallowed the riders hours ago. The landscape offered no comfort, just an endless stretch of snow, broken occasionally by stands of bare trees or the dark line of distant bluffs. In Boston, waiting had meant sitting in parlors with clocks that marked each passing minute. Here, time flowed differently, measured in heartbeats and breaths rather than mechanical precision. The young woman's soft rain joined her, her swollen belly prominent beneath her blanket wrappings. "Waiting is the hardest work," Soft Rain said, her English careful but clear. "When my husband hunts in winter, I count each breath until his return." She placed a hand on her belly. "Now I count for 2. The simple statement contained multitudes. The universal experience of women waiting for men to return from danger, the hope carried in new life, the fears that transcended all cultural boundaries. As darkness settled over the village, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that even the hot springs couldn't entirely dispel, Grace felt her anxiety rising. Surely if the search had been successful, the riders would have returned by now. She thought of Thomas out in this cold, perhaps injured, perhaps worse, and her imagination painted scenarios she couldn't bear to complete. Emma sensed her distress, abandoning her new friends to press close against Grace's side as they sat near the central fire. "Is Papa coming tonight?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Grace brushed back her daughter's dark curls, so like Thomas's, and forced confidence into her voice. "The search parties will find him, sweetheart, but they might have needed to make camp for the night. It's dangerous to travel in darkness." The explanation felt insufficient even to her own ears, but Emma nodded with the faith children place, in adults who have, thus far, kept them safe from harm. The chief approached as they sat there, his bearing dignified but his eyes kind as he looked down at Emma. "Your father is a resourceful man?" he asked through Samuel, who had remained behind to facilitate communication in the village. Grace nodded. "He's survived 2 frontier winters already. He knows to find shelter, to wait out storms." The chief considered this, then spoke again, his words carrying the weight of experience. "Then trust in his wisdom as well as in our searches. The night brings counsel, sometimes answers. Sleep now, and perhaps morning will bring what you seek." But sleep proved elusive in the quiet darkness of the borrowed lodge. Grace lay awake, listening to Emma's peaceful breathing, to the occasional call of a night bird, to the wind's changing voice as it moved around the lodge's curved sides. She thought of Thomas, of their journey west from Boston, of his determination to build something new in this harsh land. They had come for opportunity, for open spaces after the crowded confines of city life, for land they could call their own, after generations of living in rented rooms. But the frontier had provided lessons neither had anticipated, lessons about the fragility of human plans in the face of nature's power, about the complex humanity of people they'd been taught to, fear about their own capacity for adaptation and survival. Whatever happened, Grace knew she was not the same woman who had left Boston 2 years ago, not even the same woman who had made that desperate decision to leave their cabin 3 days ago. The storm had changed her, and so had its aftermath. The sound of dogs barking jolted her from fitful sleep just before dawn. Emma stirred beside her as voices rose outside, urgent calls carrying through the pre-dawn darkness. Grace pulled on the deer-hide dress and wrapped Emma quickly in her fur robe, her fingers clumsy with sleep and sudden hope. Whatever news was coming, they would face it together. Cold air hit them like a physical force as they emerged from the lodge. Torches moved near the village entrance, illuminating a gathering crowd despite the early hour. Grace counted figures. Anxiously, 1, 2, 3 riders returning, only half the search party. Her heart faltered, then raced as she recognized Samuel among them, his tall form distinctive even at a distance. Beside him rode Red Sky, and between them, "Thomas!" The cry escaped before she could contain it, Emma echoing it a heartbeat. Later, they ran together, snow crunching beneath their feet, breath coming in white clouds. The figure between the Dakota riders looked up at the sound of their voices, his face emerging from the shadows of a borrowed fur hood. "Grace? Emma?" His voice was hoarse, disbelieving, as if he feared they might be apparitions born of cold and desperation. They reached the horses as Thomas was helped down, his movements stiff with cold and what looked like injury. But his arms were strong as they closed around them both, pulling them into an embrace that felt like coming home. "You're alive," he kept saying, his voice cracking with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you both. The cabin empty, the door open to the storm. I thought." "We tried to reach the Caldwells," Grace explained, her words tumbling out between tears and laughter. "The supplies were gone, the wood nearly out. I thought we could make it 12 miles, but the storm..." She looked up at Samuel, who sat, watching their reunion with quiet satisfaction. "Samuel found us, brought us here when we were nearly gone." Thomas followed her gaze, seeming to truly register for the first time where they were, who had brought them together. His expression shifted from joy to confusion to a complex mixture of emotions Grace couldn't fully interpret. "You've been here? In a Dakota village? All this time?" There was no fear in his voice, which surprised her, just wonder and the beginning of understanding. Red Sky dismounted, his young face serious as he addressed Thomas. "Your woman and child would have died. In the snow. Samuel Whitehawk found them with the last of their strength. Our chief granted them shelter according to the old laws of hospitality. They have been under our protection." The formality of his speech emphasized the significance of what had transpired, not just a rescue, but an honoring of traditions that predated any conflicts between their peoples. Thomas straightened, wincing slightly from what Grace now saw was a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," he said, directing his words to both men, but encompassing the gathered villagers with his gaze. "My family's lives are beyond price. Whatever you ask in return, if it's within my power, it's yours." The chief approached from the main fire, where he had been conferring with the returned riders. His bearing was formal despite the hour, his face composed as he welcomed Thomas to Standing Elk Village. Through Samuel's translation, he explained briefly what had happened, how Samuel had found Grace and Emma near death in the storm, the village's decision to offer shelter, the search parties sent out when the weather cleared enough for travel. Thomas listened with growing amazement, his merchant's mind visibly calculating the dimensions of the situation and the obligations created. When the chief finished speaking, Thomas did something that surprised everyone present. He knelt in the snow, a gesture of profound respect that transcended cultural differences. "I am in your debt, now and always," he said simply. The sincerity in his voice needed no translation. Several of the watching Dakota nodded approval at this understanding of the true weight of what had transpired. The chief raised Thomas to his feet with quiet dignity. "Debts between peoples should not be measured like trade goods. What we have done, we did because it is the way of our ancestors, because the old laws demand it. But perhaps—" He paused, looking thoughtfully at the small family reunited before him. "Perhaps this opens a new path between your people and mine, one where understanding might grow in place of fear." Morning Song appeared at Grace's elbow, touching her arm with unexpected gentleness. "Come," she said in English. "Your man needs warmth, food, rest. Questions will wait for daylight." The practical suggestion broke the ceremonial atmosphere. Thomas was indeed swaying slightly with exhaustion, the ordeal of the storm and its aftermath evident in his drawn face and the way he leaned unconsciously toward Grace for support. They returned to the lodge that had sheltered Grace and Emma, Morning Song following with a pot of something that steamed in the cold air. Inside, with the fire built up against the deep chill of pre-dawn, Thomas sank onto the fur-covered sleeping platform with a groan of relief. Only then did Grace fully register the extent of his ordeal, the frost-nipped patches on his face, the makeshift bandage stained with old blood, the weight he'd lost in just days. "What happened?" she asked, helping him remove the heavy fur, wrappings the Dakota had provided. Emma pressed close to his side, unwilling to break physical contact now that she had her father back, her small face solemn as she observed his injuries. Thomas winced as Grace unwrapped the bandage on his arm, revealing a deep gash that had been expertly cleaned and packed with what looked like a poultice of herbs. "The storm hit while I was still at Bergstrom's trading post," he explained, accepting a cup of hot tea from Morning Song with a nod of thanks. "Lars wanted me to wait it out there, said nobody with sense would travel in weather like that, but I kept thinking of you two, alone at the cabin, with supplies already running low." He took a long swallow of the tea, color gradually returning to his wind-burned face. "I made it about halfway home before my horse spooked at something in the whiteout, a wolf maybe, or just the wind playing tricks. He threw me against a fallen tree and bolted. Morning Song made a sound of understanding as she examined the wound on his arm. "Clean break," she pronounced, her fingers gentle but firm as they probed the makeshift splint Red Sky had applied. "We'll heal straight if you keep still. Red Sky has skill with bones." Thomas looked startled at her assessment, then nodded slowly, as if accepting that this, too, was part of the new reality he'd awakened to. "I managed to find shelter of sorts under a rock overhang," he continued. "Built a fire, waited out the worst of the storm. When it eased enough to see more than an arm's length ahead, I started walking toward home, made it there just after dawn yesterday to find the door standing open, snow drifted inside, and you both gone." His voice caught on the memory. "I've never known fear like that moment." Grace held his hand, feeling the raw places where cold had damaged skin. "We tried to reach the Caldwells," she explained again. "The supplies were nearly gone, the firewood too. I thought—" She faltered, the weight of her near-fatal miscalculation heavy in her chest. "I thought 12 miles was possible, even in the storm. I didn't realize how quickly we'd lose our way." "I would have done the same," Thomas assured her, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Made the same choice, the same mistake. No one thinks clearly when survival hangs in the balance." He looked around the lodge, taking in the carefully constructed buffalo hide covering, the central fire with its smoke rising precisely through the smoke hole, the spare but ingenious furnishings. "But how did you come to be here? Among—" He hesitated, clearly reconsidering his word choice. "Among the Dakota." "Samuel found us," Emma piped up, awake now and eager to share the story. "We were sleeping in the snow because Mama was too tired to walk anymore. He carried me and helped Mama to a little cabin, and then he brought us here because it was closest. And then Morning Song gave me a doll and taught us how to make the fire right, and there are hot springs with steam, and I have friends now who taught me 3 Dakota words." The breathless recitation brought a smile to Thomas's exhausted face. The first real smile since his arrival. "It seems I've missed quite an adventure," he said, stroking Emma's dark curls. Grace recognized the deliberate lightness in his tone, his attempt to normalize the extraordinary situation for their daughter's sake. It was one of the things she'd always loved about him, this ability to steady their family through his calm acceptance of whatever challenges arose. As dawn light began to filter through the smoke hole, Thomas's eyelids grew heavy despite his obvious attempt to stay alert. Morning Song gestured toward the sleeping platform, her meaning clear. "Rest now," she told him in her careful English. "Questions will keep. Healing will not wait." She showed Grace how to apply a fresh poultice to his arm, explaining with gestures and simple words which herbs were being used and why. Grace settled beside Thomas as he drifted into an exhausted sleep. Emma curled against his uninjured side. Morning Song departed with the promise to return later with food, leaving the small family to the privacy of reunion. In the quiet that followed, Grace found herself studying her husband's face, the lines deepened by ordeal, the stubble that showed more gray than she remembered, the evidence of their frontier life written in small scars and weathering. They had come west with such certainty, such optimism. Thomas had spent months researching the Nebraska territory, reading accounts of its fertility, its promise for those willing to work the land. The railroad's westward expansion had seemed to guarantee prosperity for settlements along its path. Pine Valley, they'd been told, would soon become an important stop on the route to California, bringing commerce and opportunity to those who established themselves early. Reality had proven more complicated. The land yielded, but grudgingly, demanding labor that stretched from dawn to dusk and beyond. The promised railroad spur had been delayed, then rerouted, leaving Pine Valley stranded in an economic limbo, neither fully connected to eastern markets nor self-sufficient. And the relationship with the indigenous people whose land they now Occupied had been presented as a simple matter of progress replacing primitivism, a narrative Grace could never again accept after these days in Standing Elk Village. Emma stirred, her small voice pulling Grace from her reflections. "Are we going home now?" she asked, eyes still heavy with interrupted sleep. The question carried more weight than the child could understand. Home. What did that mean now? The cabin that had nearly become their tomb. Pine Valley with its narrow definitions of civilization, or something more complex that incorporated the lessons of these past days. "Soon," Grace answered, smoothing Emma's tangled hair. "When Papa is stronger, when the trails are safer." She hesitated, then added, "But I think we'll come back sometimes to visit your new friends. Would you like that?" Emma's enthusiastic nod held none of the hesitation that would have characterized Grace's own response to such a suggestion just days ago. Morning came fully to Standing Elk Village, bringing with it a buzz of activity and conversation. The return of the search party with Thomas had created ripples of curiosity throughout the community. Many who had kept their distance from Grace and Emma now found reasons to pass by their lodge, to pause with items to trade or gifts that acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. By mid-morning, Thomas was awake. Again, his color improved, his determination to understand their situation evident in the way he sat up, despite obvious pain, accepting food and asking careful questions about village life and customs. Grace watched as her husband, the man she'd sometimes feared was too rigid in his thinking, too bound by the conventions of their upbringing, engaged with Morning Song and others who came to visit, his merchant's mind absorbing new information with remarkable adaptability. "They've taught you much in a short time," he observed to Grace during a moment alone, nodding toward the perfectly constructed fire she had built without conscious thought, using the methods Morning Song had shown her. "And Emma seems half Dakota already." There was no judgment in his tone, only wonder and something that might have been admiration. "Necessity is an effective teacher," Grace replied, adjusting the furs around his shoulders. "And they have been more generous than we had any right to expect, Morning Song especially." She hesitated, then added, "She lost her daughter to disease 2 winters ago. She says Emma reminds her of her child." Thomas absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "We've been taught to see them as savages," he said finally, his voice low to prevent being overheard, "as obstacles to progress, empty figures in the landscape rather than people with their own histories, their own griefs and joys." He shook his head slowly. "I knew it wasn't that simple. You remember how I argued with Peterson about his talk of clearing the territory? But knowing in theory is different from seeing, from experiencing." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, White Feather, the village elder, accompanied by her granddaughter who served as translator. They entered the lodge with ceremonial formality, the younger woman explaining that her grandmother was the keeper of winter stories, a position of honor in Dakota culture. "She says your child should hear the stories of this land," the granddaughter translated, "that all children need to know the voices that have always lived in this place." Emma, who had been restless with the confinement of the lodge, immediately sat cross-legged before the old woman, her face alight with anticipation. Thomas and Grace exchanged glances, then nodded their permission. White Feather settled into the storyteller's posture, back straight, hands expressive, voice carrying into the space where the physical world and the world of spirit and myth could meet. Through her granddaughter's translation, White Feather told tales that had been passed down through generations, how Meadowlark had brought the first corn to the people, how Coyote had stolen fire from the sun, how the great blizzard spirits had once battled above the plains, until Star Woman had reminded them of their duty to all living things below. Emma listened with complete absorption, asking questions that delighted the old woman with their perception. Grace found herself equally captivated, not just by the stories themselves, but by their complex understanding of the relationship between humans and the land, between different creatures who shared the same world. These were not simple children's tales, but a profound cosmology, a way of making sense of existence that acknowledged both its beauty and its danger. Thomas, too, was listening intently, his merchant's mind perhaps recognizing the value in this exchange of cultural treasures. As Whitefeather concluded her final story about a lost child guided home by spirit animals who taught her the secret language of the prairie, she fixed Emma with a penetrating gaze. "You have been such a child," she said through her granddaughter, "found by one who can read the land's true voice. Remember this when you are grown. Remember that your life was returned to you by the old powers and the old ways." The gravity of the moment was broken by the arrival of several village children, eager to show Emma a new game involving small carved animal figures. With a respectful nod to the adults, Emma slipped outside, her absorption in the stories already giving way to the immediate joys of play. Whitefeather watched her go with approval in her ancient eyes. "She will remember," the old woman said, "with certainty. Not in her mind, perhaps, but in her heart. Such experiences write themselves into the spirit." She turned to Thomas, studying him with the same penetrating gaze she had directed at Emma. "And you, trader, what will you remember of this time?" Thomas met her eyes steadily, the formal address emphasizing the significance of the exchange. "I will remember that my family lives because your people chose mercy over resentment, that they found shelter when they should have found death. These are debts that can never be repaid with trade goods or coin." Whitefeather nodded slowly, apparently satisfied. "There are older currencies than silver," she said. "Truth is one, understanding another. Perhaps these are the payments that matter in the end." With that cryptic statement, she rose with her granddaughter's assistance and departed, leaving behind a sense that something significant had transpired, though its full meaning might take years to unfold. As evening approached, the chief sent word requesting their presence at the communal fire. It was clear from the formality of the invitation that this would be more than a simple meal. It would be a council, a decision point about what came next. Thomas insisted on walking rather than being carried, though his progress was slow and required Grace's support. Even in these few hours, she'd noticed his determination to engage with the village as something more than a helpless recipient of charity. The central fire blazed high against the gathering darkness, surrounded by most of the village. Places of honor had been prepared, robes spread near the chief and other elders, with Samuel positioned nearby to translate. As they approached, Grace felt the weight of dozens of eyes, some curious, some wary, most evaluating. These days in the village had begun to break down her own fear of being among the Dakota, but she realized that for many in the village, they remained unknown quantities, potentially dangerous despite their current vulnerability. The meal began. Without ceremony, various dishes passed from person to person, each taking what they needed. Grace recognized some preparations she'd helped with that morning, feeling a small pride in having contributed, however minimally, to the community that had saved them. Thomas tasted everything offered, his appreciation evident and genuine in a way that seemed to ease some of the tension around the fire. It was only after everyone had eaten that the chief rose to speak, his voice carrying through the night air. With natural authority, Samuel translated in quiet rhythm, allowing the chief's natural pauses to carry the translation without interrupting the flow of his speech. 3 nights ago, a storm came that changed many paths, the chief began. A woman and child were found, nearly claimed by the snow. Our laws, older than any here can remember, say that such travelers must be sheltered, that the hand of mercy must extend even to those from whom we have received no mercy. And so it was done, not because we sought reward or recognition, but because to do otherwise would have broken faith with our ancestors and with the spirits who guard our people. Thomas listened intently, his face serious in the firelight. The chief continued, his gestures becoming more expansive as he described the village's decision, the debates that had occurred, the eventual consensus that hospitality must prevail over suspicion. And now we see that this decision has brought not just 2 lives saved, but perhaps a new understanding. A trader who speaks with respect, a child who plays with our children as if no boundaries existed, a woman who learns our ways with open hands and open heart. He paused, looking directly at Thomas and Grace. Tomorrow, if weather permits, you will return to your settlement. You will carry with you not just your lives, but a story of who we truly are, not who you have been told we are. This story is precious. It is a seed that might grow into something we cannot yet imagine. The weight of expectation in his words was unmistakable. This was not just a farewell, but a commission, a responsibility placed squarely on their shoulders. Thomas struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain, but his voice steady as he responded. My family lives because of your people's mercy. This is a truth I will never forget, never deny. When I return to Pine Valley, I will speak this truth, whatever the cost. He hesitated, then added, but I must be honest. There are many who will not wish to hear it, who profit from fear, from the belief that this land belongs only to those who look like me. The brutal honesty of the statement hung in the air, acknowledged with grave nods from several elders. Truth faces resistance like water faces stone, the chief replied, but water prevails in time, wearing paths where none seemed possible. He gestured toward Emma, who was sitting with the village children, their heads bent together over some game involving small, polished stones. And sometimes new paths come not from grand declarations, but from small exchanges. A child's friendship, a woman's learning, a man's new understanding. Morning Song spoke then, her voice carrying with the authority of age and experience. The woman and child have learned our ways, she said, nodding toward Grace. The woman works with willing hands. The child speaks words of our language already. They have seen us as people, not as shadows. This is a beginning. Murmurs of agreement rose from several women who had worked with Grace these past days. Red Sky, who had been silent throughout the meal and discussion, finally stood. As the leader of the hunting party that had found Thomas, his perspective carried particular weight. I did not trust them, he said plainly, his young face serious. In the firelight, even as we searched for the husband, I wondered if saving him was wisdom or foolishness. But I have watched them these days. They learn, they listen, they see us as people. He looked directly at Thomas. If settlers can learn this, perhaps there is hope. Thomas nodded, acknowledging both the criticism and the grudging acceptance. In Red Sky's words, hope is often found in unexpected places, he replied. My people came west seeking it, believing it lay in the land itself. Perhaps instead it lies in what you have shown us, that survival depends not on conquering this land, but on understanding it and understanding those who have always been its guardians. The chief raised his hands, signaling the formal end of the council. Return to your people, he told Thomas and Grace. Speak truth. Remember what you have seen here. When spring comes, when the trails open, perhaps new paths will open as well. Not just for goods to be traded, but for understanding to grow. It was both blessing and challenge, a vision of possibility and a recognition of the difficulties that lay ahead. As they walked slowly back to their lodge, guided by Morning Song's sure steps through the darkness, Grace felt the weight of the evening's discussions. They had been given a responsibility few settlers ever received, to be witnesses to a truth that contradicted everything they'd been taught about the frontier and its indigenous inhabitants. How would Pine Valley respond to such testimony? How would they navigate the complex currents of prejudice, economic interest, and political pressure that shaped frontier relationships? Morning Song seemed to sense her turmoil. "Sleep now," she advised as they reached the lodge entrance. "Tomorrow brings its own questions. Tonight is for rest and healing." Her practical wisdom cut through the tangle of Grace's thoughts, reminding her that great changes began with small steps, with the immediate needs of family and community. Inside the lodge, with Emma already asleep on the fur-covered platform, Thomas drew Grace close despite his injuries. "I've been thinking about our cabin," he said quietly, "about the changes we might make, the lessons we could apply from what you've learned here. The fire design alone would make winters more bearable. And perhaps we could plant some of those herbs Morning Song showed you, the ones that help with fever and cold." The pragmatic approach was so characteristic of her husband that Grace almost laughed, tension dissolving at the familiar pattern of his thinking. Thomas had always been a builder, a problem solver. He absorbed new information and immediately looked for ways to apply it, to improve their situation. It was this quality that had brought them west in the first place. This belief that knowledge properly applied could overcome any obstacle. "Do you think Pine Valley is ready for a cabin that incorporates Dakota wisdom?" she asked, only half joking. Thomas's expression turned thoughtful in the low firelight. "Perhaps not all at once," he admitted, "but small changes might lead to larger ones. The frontier has always been about adaptation. We've just been limited in where we look for solutions." They talked deep into the night, their voices low to avoid waking Emma, discussing not just practical modifications to their home, but larger questions about their place in the complex tapestry of frontier life. How would they honor the obligation they now carried? How would they navigate between the world of Pine Valley, with its rigid definitions of progress and civilization, and what they had experienced in Standing Elk Village? Morning brought clear skies and preparations for departure. The storm had finally released its grip on the Nebraska territory, leaving behind a transformed landscape of sculpted drifts and brilliant white expanses that sparkled in the sunlight. Thomas stood outside the lodge, testing his strength against the bitter cold, his injured arm bound firmly in a sling crafted by Morning Song from deer hide and fur. "We should wait another day," Grace suggested, watching the way he favored his right side, the pallor that came and went beneath his wind-burned skin. But Thomas shook his head, determination evident in the set of his jaw. "Pine Valley will be searching for us by now. The longer we're gone, the more likely someone does something foolish." Indeed, the unspoken concern hung between them, that a search party from the settlement might encounter Dakota hunters, that misunderstanding might lead to violence, that the fragile connection they'd established might be severed before it had a chance to grow. Preparations continued throughout the morning. The chief had assigned 2 young men to guide them safely back to their settlement. One of them, Red Sky, whose initial suspicion had gradually transformed into grudging respect. 3 horses had been provided, strong, sure-footed animals accustomed to winter travel. Thomas had tried to offer payment, pulling a small pouch of trading beads from his coat pocket, but the chief had refused with gentle firmness. "These are not trade goods," he explained through Samuel's translation. "These are the means by which you will carry our story back to your people. The true payment will come in the words you speak, the understanding you share." The weight of expectation in his words was undeniable. This was not charity, but investment in possibility, in a future different from the conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable across the frontier. Emma was having difficulty saying goodbye to her new friends. In just 3 days, she had formed connections that transcended language and cultural boundaries. Playing the universal games of childhood, learning words and songs, sharing the easy camaraderie that adults often found so elusive. The corn-husk doll from Soft Rain was clutched in her small hand, a tangible connection to this place that had sheltered them when death seemed certain. Morning Song approached as they prepared to mount, her weathered face solemn but her eyes warm as she looked at Emma. From a small pouch at her waist, she withdrew an object that caught the winter sunlight, a pendant carved from bone hanging from a leather cord. "For remembering," she said in her careful English, placing it around Emma's neck. "From my small bird to you, protection on the trail ahead." Grace felt tears threaten as she recognized the significance of the gift, something personal, something that had belonged to Morning Song's daughter, freely given to the child who had somehow eased some measure of her grief. "We will remember," she promised, the words inadequate for the emotions they carried, "and we will return when the trails open in spring." Thomas, who had witnessed the exchange with characteristic thoughtfulness, stepped forward despite his injuries. From inside his coat, he withdrew a small object wrapped in oilcloth, a book, Grace realized with surprise. It was his journal, the one he'd carried since leaving Boston, filled with observations about the land, the settlements, the challenges and triumphs of frontier life. "For your grandson," he said to Morning Song, nodding toward a boy of perhaps 12 who had been watching the preparations with intense curiosity, "that he might know something of our journey as we have learned of yours." Samuel translated, and Morning Song accepted the gift with quiet dignity, recognizing the reciprocal nature of the exchange. Knowledge for knowledge, story for story. The moment of departure arrived with the sun high overhead, the temperature as mild as winter ever became in this harsh landscape. Red Sky mounted first, checking the lead ropes that would connect their horses, ensuring that even if visibility deteriorated, they would remain together. Thomas was helped onto the second horse, his face tight with pain, but his posture straight, refusing to show weakness before those who had shown such strength. Grace settled Emma before her on the third horse, securing the child with a technique Morning Song had demonstrated, a partial wrapping that would allow movement but prevent falling should sleep claim her during the journey. The entire village had gathered to witness their departure, a circle of faces that now held familiarity where once there had been only the strangeness of the unknown. The chief raised his hand in a gesture of blessing or farewell, perhaps both. "May the spirits guide your path," Samuel translated. "May the truth you carry find fertile ground." It was both benediction and charge, a recognition of the responsibility they now bore. Thomas nodded solemnly, unable to raise his injured arm, but conveying his respect through the depth of his gaze. As they rode away from Standing Elk Village, Grace found herself looking back repeatedly, trying to fix the image in her memory. The circle of teepees set against the winter landscape, the central fire sending smoke spiraling into the clear blue sky. The figures growing smaller with distance, but remaining distinct against the whiteness. They were departing with far more than they had arrived with, and it wasn't the physical gifts that weighed most heavily in her awareness. The journey back to Pine Valley took most of the day, following trails that wound through sheltered valleys where the snow lay less deep. Red Sky led them with quiet confidence, reading the land's subtle language even where obvious markers had been erased by the storm. Occasionally, he would point out signs that would have been invisible to Grace's untrained eye. The slight depression that indicated a creek running beneath the snow, the particular way certain trees bent that suggested water sources nearby, the tracks of animals that revealed safe passages through deeper drifts. Emma, initially chattering with excitement about returning home and seeing her kitten and showing her friends the corn-husk doll, gradually fell silent as the miles passed, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's movement and the warmth of being pressed against her mother. Grace felt her own mind drifting as well, moving between immediate awareness of the journey and deeper reflections on all that had transpired since that desperate decision to leave their cabin 3 days ago. How would Pine Valley receive them? How would they explain where they had been, who had saved them? The settlement, though small, encompassed the full spectrum of frontier attitudes toward the indigenous inhabitants. Some, like Peterson, spoke openly of clearing the territory, using language that made Grace's skin crawl with its casual brutality. Others, like Reverend Mills, preached a paternalistic vision of civilizing the savages, an approach that now seemed equally misguided after what she had witnessed in Standing Elk Village. Thomas, riding slightly ahead, seemed to sense her thoughts. "We'll tell the truth," he said simply, turning in his saddle despite the pain it clearly caused. "Not everything at once, perhaps, but we won't deny where we've been or who saved us." His face, gaunt with exhaustion but determined, reminded Grace of why she had followed this man west in the first place. His fundamental decency, his willingness to see beyond the boundaries others accepted without question. It was mid-afternoon when the first signs of Pine Valley appeared on the horizon. Smoke rising from chimneys, the dark shapes of buildings standing starkly against the snow-covered landscape. Red Sky reined in his horse, his expression carefully, neutral as he surveyed the settlement. "We stop here," he said in his careful English. "Not wise for us to enter your town." Thomas nodded in understanding. The Dakota presence in Pine Valley would likely cause more confusion than clarity, might even spark hostility before they had a chance to explain. "We can make it from here," he agreed, "and we're grateful for your guidance." The formal words seemed inadequate for the debt they owed, but Red Sky accepted them with quiet dignity. "Remember what you have seen," he told them, his young face solemn in the winter light. "Remember that we could have chosen differently. That is the story you must tell." The responsibility in his words echoed the chief's message, that their experience carried an obligation that extended beyond personal gratitude into something larger, something that might reshape the future of this contested frontier. As they parted ways, Emma suddenly called out, waving vigorously to the young warriors, "Tell Morning Song I'll practice my beadwork. Tell Soft Rain I'll take care of the doll." The simple promises, delivered with a child's earnestness, brought a rare smile to Red Sky's serious face. He raised his hand in farewell, then turned his horse, disappearing with his companion into a stand of cottonwoods, with a silent grace that seemed to merge them with the landscape itself. The approach to Pine Valley felt strangely dreamlike after the intense reality of their time in Standing Elk Village. The settlement, which had once represented safety and civilization to Grace, now seemed somehow artificial, buildings imposed upon the land rather than growing from it. Straight lines and sharp angles where nature offered curves and organic forms. The smoke from chimneys rose differently from the smoke of the village fires, carrying the scent of coal rather than the sweet aroma of well-chosen wood. They were spotted before they reached the main street. A shout went up from the direction of Bergstrom's trading post, and suddenly people were pouring from buildings, running through snow, voices raised in a chorus of surprise and relief. Reverend Mills reached them first, his normally composed features alight with emotion as he helped Thomas dismount. "Thank the Lord," he kept saying, supporting Thomas's weight as the exhausted man's legs threatened to buckle. "We feared the worst when the search parties found nothing." Peterson was organizing another expedition for tomorrow, talking of bringing the territorial militia if necessary. The mention of armed searchers confirmed Thomas's concerns. Their prolonged absence might have sparked exactly the kind of confrontation they now hoped to prevent. Mrs. Caldwell appeared at Grace's side, helping her down from the horse, exclaiming over Emma's deer hide clothing and the obvious signs of their ordeal. "Where on earth have you been?" she asked, her voice carrying both concern and unmistakable curiosity. "How did you survive that storm?" Similar questions echoed from the growing crowd, a babble of voices that seemed overwhelming after the measured cadence of conversation in the Dakota village. Thomas raised his good arm, calling for quiet with the natural authority he'd always possessed. "We've had a journey none of us expected," he said, his voice carrying despite his exhaustion. "One that's changed how we see this territory and our place in it." He swayed slightly, and Reverend Mills tightened his supporting grip. "But explanations can wait. Right now we need rest and the comfort of our own home." The mention of home brought an exchange of glances among the settlers that Grace didn't miss. "Your cabin took significant damage in the storm," Lars Bergstrom said, stepping forward from the crowd. "The roof partially collapsed under the snow weight. We've been making repairs, but it's not yet habitable." The news should have been devastating. Their home, their security, compromised just when they needed it most. But Grace found herself strangely unmoved. After facing death in the storm, after finding unexpected shelter among those they'd been taught to fear, the physical structure of their cabin seemed somehow less important than it once had. "You'll stay with us," Martha Caldwell declared, brooking no argument. "We've plenty of room, and Emma can play with our Sarah. You'll be comfortable until your place is properly repaired." The offer was generous, characteristic of frontier hospitality, where survival often depended on mutual aid. Grace accepted with genuine gratitude, though a small part of her already missed the simple functionality of the Dakota Lodge, its perfect adaptation to the harsh realities of winter on the plains. News of their return spread quickly through the small settlement. By the time they reached the Caldwells' comfortable frame house, it seemed half of Pine Valley had gathered, eager for their story, hungry for details of their survival against impossible odds. Thomas, however, was clearly at the end of his strength. Dr. Patterson arrived to examine his arm, confirming Morning Song's assessment that the break was clean, but adding his own warnings about rest and recovery. "Whatever tale you have to tell can wait until morning," he pronounced, mixing a powder in water that he insisted Thomas drink for the pain. "You've survived thus far. No need to exhaust yourself further with explanations tonight." The practical wisdom in this advice was undeniable. Grace felt her own reserves dwindling, the emotional weight of their journey finally catching up now. That immediate danger had passed. They settled into the Caldwells' guest room, a small but comfortable space with a proper bed that seemed impossibly soft after the sleeping platforms of the Dakota Lodge. Emma, overtired and overwhelmed by the return to familiar surroundings, fell asleep almost instantly, still clutching the corn husk doll that connected her to the friends she'd made in Standing Elk Village. Grace sat beside her for a long time, watching her child's peaceful breathing, reflecting on how close they had come to losing everything. Thomas joined her despite Dr. Patterson's orders to rest, easing himself carefully onto the bed beside Emma. "We need to decide what we'll tell them," he said quietly, his voice already slightly slurred from the doctor's medication. "How much? How soon?" Grace considered this, weighing the complexity of their situation against the simplicity of truth. "We tell them we were rescued by Dakota scouts," she said finally, "that we were taken to their village when we were too weak to travel further, that they treated us with kindness and respect, shared their food and knowledge, searched for you when the storm broke." She paused, then added, "We tell them what we saw, not what they expect to hear." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes already closing despite his evident determination to stay awake. "It won't be easy," he murmured. "Some don't want to hear that the savages are capable of mercy. It complicates their vision of progress, of manifest destiny." The bitter edge in his voice revealed how profoundly his own perspective had shifted in just days. "We'll start with those who might listen," Grace decided, practical as always. "Martha seems genuinely curious about the clothing, the doll. Reverend Mills, for all his missionary zeal, believes in Christian charity. He can hardly condemn those who exemplified it when we needed it most. We build understanding one conversation at a time, just as the chief suggested. Thomas's hand found hers in the dim light, squeezing with surprising strength given his condition. "We owe them our lives," he said simply. "The least we can give in return is truth." The sentiment carried all the weight of a vow, a commitment that would shape their future in ways they could not yet fully imagine. Morning brought the inevitable. Gathering of neighbors, their curiosity barely contained behind expressions of concern and offers of assistance. Martha Caldwell served breakfast to a house full of Pine Valley's most prominent citizens. Reverend Mills and his wife, Lars Bergstrom from the trading post, the Pattersons, even old man Whitaker, who rarely left his cabin at the edge of town. The presence of so many indicated the significance of the Hendersons' return, the hunger for their story in a community where news traveled slowly and events of note were few. Thomas, rested if not fully recovered, sat at the head of the table, his injured arm properly splintered now by Dr. Patterson. Grace noticed how carefully he observed the gathered faces, measuring their potential receptiveness to the truth he was about to share. Emma had been whisked away by the Caldwell children, though she'd first made Grace promise they would show everyone her cornhusk doll and tell them about her Dakota friends later. "I suppose everyone wants to know what happened." Thomas began without preamble, once the plates had been filled. "How we survived the worst storm in recent memory." Nods and murmurs of agreement circled the table. Martha Caldwell leaned forward eagerly, her kind face alight with anticipation. Lars Bergstrom's expression was more measured, his merchant's mind perhaps already calculating the implications of whatever Thomas might reveal. The short version is simple, though the truth it contains may be difficult for some to accept, Thomas continued. "My family lives because Dakota scouts found them when they were nearly frozen to death, because Dakota healers tended their frostbite and exhaustion, because a Dakota village welcomed them when they had nowhere else to go." He delivered these facts without embellishment, allowing their stark reality to ripple through the gathered settlers. The reactions were as varied as the personalities present. Martha Caldwell gasped, her hand flying to her throat in astonishment. Reverend Mills's bushy eyebrows rose toward his receding hairline, his expression caught between dogmatic certainty and genuine curiosity. Lars Bergstrom merely nodded slightly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Old man Whitaker snorted, muttering something under his breath that Grace couldn't quite catch, but suspected was dismissive. "You were in an Indian village?" Mrs. Patterson finally asked, breaking the stunned silence. "For how long?" The question carried all the weight of the settlement's collective anxiety about their indigenous neighbors, concern that proximity might somehow contaminate that understanding, might undermine the rigid categories that made frontier expansion possible. 3 days, Grace answered, deciding it was time to add her voice to Thomas's. Days during which we were treated with nothing but respect and kindness. Days that taught us how little we truly understood about the people whose land we now occupy. She kept her tone measured, factual rather than challenging, but she didn't soften the essential truth of their experience. Reverend Mills cleared his throat, clearly struggling to integrate this information with his preconceived notions. God works in mysterious ways, he offered finally, using the heathen to deliver his children from peril. Grace bit back a sharp response, recognizing that the minister was at least attempting to find a framework for accepting what they were telling him. They're not heathens, Thomas corrected mildly. They have their own spiritual traditions, their own understanding of the world. Different from ours, yes, but not without wisdom. He described the council fire, the careful governance of the village, the sophisticated medical knowledge that had treated his broken arm and their frostbite. Bergstrom nodded again, more decisively this time. "I've traded with Standing Elk's people for 3 winters now," he admitted. "Always found them fair dealers, though I've kept that opinion mostly to myself." The admission surprised Grace, that there had been regular contact, perhaps even a measure of respect, hidden beneath the settlement's official wariness. Old man Whitaker wasn't so easily convinced. "Friendly now, maybe," he growled, "but what about next month when hunting's scarce? Next year, when more settlers arrive? You can't trust an Indian further than you can throw him." The casual prejudice, in his words, made Grace's stomach tighten, but she recognized it as the frontier conventional wisdom it was, born of fear, perpetuated by ignorance, resistant to revision. "I trust the Dakota who found my family more than I trust many white men I've met on this frontier," Thomas replied evenly, his gaze steady on Whitaker's weathered face. "They had every reason to leave them to die, to see 2 fewer settlers as an advantage. Instead, they chose mercy. They chose to see Grace and Emma as people first, not as threats or enemies." The simple logic of this observation seemed to give even Whitaker pause, though he harumphed and applied himself to his breakfast without further comment. Martha Caldwell, who had been listening with increasing fascination, turned to Grace. "The clothes you were wearing when you arrived, those beautiful moccasins, Emma's dress, those were given to you." Her genuine interest offered Grace a natural opening to describe Morning Song's generosity, the practical knowledge shared among the women of the village, the friendship that had transcended language barriers. As the conversation continued, Grace observed a gradual shift in the room's atmosphere. Not a complete transformation. Whitaker remained skeptical, Mrs. Patterson clearly uncomfortable with the whole subject, but a softening of absolute certainty, a willingness to consider that their understanding of Dakota life and culture might be incomplete. Thomas spoke of Samuel Whitehawk's tracking skills, of Red Sky's expertise in setting broken bones, of the chief's wisdom in governing his people. Grace described the ingenious construction of the lodges, the effective use of available materials, the sophisticated knowledge of local plants and their properties. Emma returned with the Caldwell children just as breakfast was concluding, proudly, displaying her corn-husk doll to the assembled adults. "Soft rain made her for me," she announced, unaware of the complex tensions her innocent statement navigated. "She's going to have a baby soon, and she says our children can be friends when the snow melts." The simple expression of hopeful connection, delivered with a child's directness, carried more persuasive power than all the careful explanations Thomas and Grace had offered. In the days that followed, as they settled back into Pine Valley life while their cabin was repaired, the story of their rescue and shelter spread throughout the settlement. Some, like Peterson, received it with open skepticism, suggesting that the Hendersons had been coerced into speaking well of their captors. Others, particularly the women who had struggled with the practical challenges of frontier housekeeping, showed genuine interest in the techniques Grace had learned, asking to see the moccasins, wondering aloud if such knowledge might be shared more broadly. Thomas, once his strength began to return, took a more active role in reshaping the settlement's understanding of their Dakota neighbors. He spoke openly at Bergstrom's trading post about the rescue, challenging the casual prejudice he encountered with first-hand testimony. He met with Reverend Mills, suggesting that true Christian charity might involve learning from those whose understanding of the land predated European arrival rather than assuming the superiority of Eastern ways. Not all were receptive. Some settlers crossed the street to avoid conversation when they saw the Hendersons approaching. Anonymous notes appeared, suggesting that Indian lovers might be happier living somewhere else. Peterson openly questioned Thomas's loyalty to his own kind, implying that the experience had somehow compromised his judgment or his allegiance to America's westward expansion. But others listened. Martha Caldwell organized a sewing circle where Grace demonstrated beadwork techniques she'd learned from Morning Song. Lars Bergstrom began stocking more fair trade goods from Dakota craftspeople, displaying them prominently in his store rather than keeping them in back rooms for specialty customers. Even Reverend Mills, though he never abandoned his missionary conviction that Christianity should be brought to indigenous peoples, began speaking more respectfully of Dakota spirituality and governance in his Sunday sermons. As winter slowly released its grip on the Nebraska territory, as the first signs of spring began to appear in melting snow and birds returning from southern migrations, Thomas and Grace found themselves planning for a journey. Their cabin had been repaired, improved even, with modifications based on what they'd learned about effective insulation and fire management from their time in Standing Elk Village. Their place in Pine Valley had been redefined. Not outcasts, but not quite conforming to frontier expectations either, occupying a new middle ground of their own creation. "We promised we'd return when the trails opened," Thomas reminded Grace. One evening, as they sat on their newly rebuilt porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of pink and gold, Emma was already asleep inside, the corn-husk doll that had never left her possession tucked beside her pillow. "To show them we meant what we said about building understanding, not just trade." Grace nodded, her fingers working a piece of leather into a new pair of moccasins. Morning Song's teachings had stayed with her, incorporated now into her daily life alongside the skills she'd brought from Boston. "I wonder if Soft Rain's baby has arrived," she mused. "If Morning Song's grandson has read your journal." The connections formed in those extraordinary days felt real and lasting, threads in a new fabric being woven across cultural boundaries that had once seemed impermeable. Emma emerged from the cabin, rubbing sleep from her eyes, drawn by the sound of her parents' voices. "Are we going back to see my friends soon?" she asked, climbing into Thomas's lap, despite being almost too big for such gestures. "I've been practicing my Dakota words every night. I can say 10 things now." Thomas smoothed her dark curls, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, awareness, perhaps, of the unique role his daughter might play in the unfolding story of this frontier. "Yes, sweetheart, when the last snow melts, when the creeks run clear again, we'll go back to Standing Elk Village, and you can show your friends how much you've learned." The promise settled over the small family like a blessing, a commitment to a future different from the one they'd imagined when they first came west. They had sought land, opportunity, the chance to build something that belonged solely to them. What they'd found instead was connection to the land itself, to its original inhabitants, to a vision of coexistence that challenged the prevailing narrative of conquest and displacement. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace thought of Morning Song's words about storms, that they came not to punish, but to teach, to reveal truths that might otherwise remain hidden. The blizzard that had nearly claimed their lives had indeed taught them, had torn away illusions and prejudices, had shown them the humanity in those they'd been told to fear. And in that teaching lay hope, not just for their family, but perhaps for the contested ground they all now shared, for a story still being written on the Nebraska plains, word by word, choice by choice, season by season. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.